I found the forged documents in my son's laptop bag while he was showering, 3 hours before the county assessor was supposed to arrive for what Derek had told me was a routine property evaluation. The papers showed my 180-acre farm valued at $12 million instead of the $2.8 million I knew it was worth, complete with fake mineral rights reports and fabricated oil survey data that made it look like black gold was sitting under my cornfields. Derek's handwriting was all over the margins, calculating percentages and investor returns, planning how he'd split the inflated sale price with his business partners once I signed the papers he'd hidden in my kitchen drawer. I heard the shower turn off upstairs and realized my 32-year-old son had spent 6 months lying to my face, setting up an elaborate fraud scheme that would destroy my life savings and probably land me in federal prison. The laptop screen showed his last Google search: "How long do elderly fraud victims stay in jail?" And I understood that Derek hadn't just planned to steal my farm. He'd planned to let me take the blame for everything. My name is Ezekiel Hartman, though most folks around Millbrook County just call me Zeke. At 68, I still wake up at 5:30 every morning to check on the cattle and walk the fence lines that border my property. The farm has been in my family for 4 generations, 180 acres of rolling hills and fertile bottomland that my great-grandfather bought in 1923 for $800 and a handshake. The farmhouse sits on a small rise overlooking the pastures, white clapboard siding that I repaint every few years, and a wraparound porch where I drink my coffee and watch the sun come up over the oak trees my father planted when I was Derek's age. Inside, the rooms are simple and practical: hardwood floors worn smooth by decades of work boots, furniture my late wife Martha picked out 30 years ago, family photos covering the mantelpiece in the living room. My evenings are spent in town at Murphy's Diner, where I meet other farmers to complain about grain prices and weather patterns over pie and coffee that's always too strong. The waitress, Carol, knows I want decaf after 7 o'clock and extra sugar in my apple pie. These people have watched me struggle through drought years and celebrate good harvests, helped me bury Martha 5 years ago, and understood when I needed space to grieve. This was my world, built on handshake deals and neighbors who looked out for each other. A place where your word meant something and family came first, no matter what. That's what I believed until I found those papers and realized my own son saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his ambition. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed. Some truths need to be told. Derek moved back to the farm 18 months ago, claiming his tech startup had failed and he needed time to figure out his next move. I'd welcomed him home, glad to have family around again after years of eating dinner alone and talking to the cattle more than people. He'd always been smart, maybe too smart for his own good. Full scholarship to State University, computer science degree, then 5 years in Chicago working for companies I couldn't pronounce. Martha used to worry that city life had changed him, made him see everything in terms of money and opportunities instead of relationships and responsibilities. But when he came home, Derek seemed different. Humbler, maybe. He helped with farm chores, fixed the ancient tractor that had been giving me trouble, even suggested we plant soybeans in the north field because commodity prices were trending higher. We'd sit on the porch after dinner, and he'd tell me about his startup ideas, how technology could revolutionize agriculture, make small farms more profitable. I started thinking maybe Martha had been wrong. Maybe Derek had just needed to come home to remember what mattered. The first red flag came when he suggested I get the farm appraised. Property values were rising, he said, and I should know what the land was worth for insurance purposes. When I hesitated, he offered to arrange everything, handle the paperwork, make sure I got a fair evaluation. The second warning I missed was when Derek started asking detailed questions about my will, about whether I'd updated it recently, about what would happen to the farm if something happened to me. He framed it as concern for my welfare, making sure my affairs were in order. The third sign was the phone calls he'd take in his room, conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked by. Business calls, he'd say when I asked. Potential investors interested in his new ideas. I thought I was watching my son rebuild his life. Instead, I was watching him plan the systematic destruction of mine. The county assessor was supposed to arrive at 2 o'clock that Thursday afternoon. Derek had been nervous all morning, checking his phone constantly, pacing between the kitchen and the front porch like he was waiting for something important to happen. I found the laptop bag sitting on Derek's bed while he was in the shower. The zipper was partly open, and I could see papers sticking out. I told myself I was just being curious, maybe a little concerned about why my son seemed so anxious lately. The first document I pulled out made my blood freeze. It was a property appraisal report with my name and address, dated 3 days ago, claiming my farm was worth $12 million. The second page showed mineral rights documentation I'd never seen before, indicating substantial oil deposits beneath my land. The third page was a geological survey report, complete with charts and technical language that made it look official and legitimate. But I knew my land better than anyone, had farmed it for 43 years, and there was no oil under my cornfields. The mineral rights had been sold off in 1956 to pay for my grandfather's medical bills. These documents were elaborate fakes, designed to inflate my property value by more than 4 times its actual worth. My hands were shaking when I found Derek's notebook, filled with calculations and phone numbers, and what looked like a business plan. The margins contained notes about investor percentages, timeline schedules, and something that made my chest tight: old man signs papers Friday, transfers money Monday, file bankruptcy Tuesday. At the bottom of the notebook, in Derek's handwriting, was a list of federal fraud penalties and average prison sentences for property crimes involving victims over 65. The shower stopped running upstairs, and I heard Derek moving around in his room. I slid everything back into the laptop bag and walked downstairs to the kitchen, where I found the purchase contract he'd hidden in my utility drawer. The document was filled out and ready for my signature, with a sale price of $11.5 million to a company called Hartman Holdings, LLC. I sat at my kitchen table and realized my son had turned me into his mark. I drove my pickup truck to the old quarry road where I used to take Derek fishing when he was 8 years old. The same spot where I'd taught him to bait a hook and cast a line, where we'd sit quietly for hours and I'd tell him stories about his grandfather and the early days of the farm. The quarry was empty that afternoon, just me and the sound of wind through the pine trees Martha had loved. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and tried to understand how the boy who'd cried when we had to put down his sick calf had grown into a man who could plan to destroy his own father. The fraud scheme was elegant in its cruelty. Derek would use the fake appraisal to convince me to sell the farm at an inflated price. His investors would pay the money into an escrow account, then discover the mineral rights were worthless and the land wasn't worth nearly what they'd paid. When they demanded their money back, I'd be the one holding the fraudulent documents, the one who'd sign the contracts, the one facing federal charges. Derek would claim he'd been deceived too, that his old father had lied to him about the property value. With me in prison, he'd inherit everything legitimately through my will. I thought about Martha's funeral, how Derek had stood beside me at her graveside and promised he'd always take care of me. How he'd held my arm when the dirt hit her coffin and whispered that family was all we had left. Sitting in that empty quarry, I made a decision that would have surprised my gentle wife, but would have made my grandfather proud. Sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to let someone experience the consequences of their choices. I spent that night in my workshop behind the barn, surrounded by tools and spare parts and the smell of motor oil that had always helped me think clearly. The plan that came to me was simple, brutal, and perfectly legal. Derek expected me to sign those papers on Friday. Instead, I was going to give him exactly what he'd planned for me. The next morning, I drove to Millbrook and met with Tom Brennan, the only lawyer in town who'd been practicing longer than I'd been farming. I showed him Derek's fake documents and explained the fraud scheme, watching his face get redder with each page he turned. Tom made 3 phone calls while I sat in his office. The first was to the state attorney general's office, reporting suspected real estate fraud. The second was to the FBI field office in Springfield, where Tom had a contact who specialized in financial crimes. The third call was to Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd known Derek since he was in Little League and who agreed to sign a court order that afternoon. But I made a mistake that nearly ruined everything. I went home and confronted Derek directly, told him I'd found his papers and knew what he was planning. I expected shame, apologies, maybe even relief that his plan had been discovered before he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Instead, Derek looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize and asked how much money I wanted to keep quiet about his business opportunity. When I told him there wasn't enough money in the world, he suggested that maybe I was getting senile, that stress from living alone on the farm was affecting my judgment. That's when I realized Derek had already crossed every line that mattered. He'd stopped seeing me as his father months ago. In his mind, I was already just an old man who'd outlived his usefulness. I walked away from that conversation knowing that mercy wasn't going to save either of us. Friday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, Derek's county assessor arrived at my front door. Except it wasn't a county assessor. It was FBI Special Agent Sarah Chin, wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase that contained recording equipment and a federal warrant. Derek answered the door with a smile that died when Agent Chin showed him her badge and explained that she was investigating reports of real estate fraud involving my property. She asked if we could all sit down in the living room and discuss the appraisal documents Derek had prepared. I watched my son's face go through stages of confusion, denial, and then cold calculation as he realized what was happening. He tried to explain that there had been some misunderstanding, that he was just trying to help his elderly father understand his property's value. Agent Chin opened her briefcase and pulled out copies of Derek's fake geological surveys, his fabricated mineral rights reports, and his notebook full of fraud calculations. She explained that creating false documents to inflate property values was a federal crime, that using those documents in an interstate business transaction carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Derek looked at me sitting in my father's old recliner and asked why I'd called the FBI instead of talking to him first. His voice had that same tone he'd used when he was 12 and got caught stealing money from Martha's purse. Not sorry for what he'd done, just angry about getting caught. Agent Chin asked Derek if he wanted to explain how he'd obtained geological survey data that contradicted official county records, or if he preferred to discuss the matter with his attorney. She mentioned that his business partners at Hartman Holdings LLC had already been arrested in Chicago that morning. That's when Derek finally understood that his careful plan had become his trap. The fake appraisal he'd created to defraud his investors was now evidence against him. The mineral rights documents he'd forged to inflate the property value were federal crimes. The notebook where he'd calculated prison sentences had become his own prophecy. Derek was arrested that evening in my driveway, handcuffed beside the same oak tree where Martha used to hang laundry on summer mornings. Agent Chin read him his rights while I stood on my porch, watching my son's face finally show something that looked like genuine emotion. The federal prosecutor offered Derek a plea bargain, 10 years in minimum security prison if he cooperated fully and helped recover the money his Chicago partners had already stolen from other victims. Without the plea, he was facing 25 years for interstate fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges. Derek's lawyer advised him to take the deal. I testified at his sentencing hearing 6 months later. Not as a victim seeking vengeance, but as his father trying to help Judge Morrison understand that Derek was capable of change if prison gave him time to remember who he used to be. The judge sentenced him to 8 years, with possibility of parole in 5 if he maintained good behavior and completed a degree program in prison. Derek looked at me from the defendant's table when the sentence was read. Not with anger or blame, but with something that might have been recognition. Maybe even respect for the father who'd refused to be his victim. I drove home to my farm that afternoon and sat on the porch where Derek and I used to talk about his startup dreams. The county had confirmed that my land was worth exactly what I'd always known it was worth, $2.8 million of fertile soil and honest work. The for sale sign I'd put up that morning would bring a fair price from a family who understood that some things can't be stolen, only earned. 2 years later, I got a letter from Derek at the federal prison in Terre Haute. He'd earned his associate degree in agricultural business and wanted to know if I thought there might be a place for him on the farm when he got out. I wrote back and told him the farm had been sold to the Morrison family, whose youngest son had just graduated from agricultural college and needed a place to start his own life. But I'd kept the house and 5 acres, enough space for a man to grow a garden and raise a few chickens. There would always be room for him there, I wrote, if he came home as my son instead of as someone looking for opportunities. I never sent that letter. Some lessons take time to sink in, and Derek needed to finish learning his without interference from me. But I kept it in my desk drawer next to the deed to my small piece of land, a reminder that love and consequence aren't opposites. Sometimes they're exactly the same thing. The truth has a way of balancing the books, if you're patient enough to let it work.